Hey kid, welcome back to your Kidtime Storytime. Excuse me, Don. It's Donnie, actually, the donkey. Today, as you can see, we are reading, again, from one of my very favorite books, Magic Carpet. And today's story, appropriately enough, is Donkey Fever. That's why Donnie wanted to hang out. Pinocchio was a wooden marionette. You know marionette means puppet, right? He was a marionette who came alive. Like many boys, he did not enjoy studying, so he ran away to the country of nothing but play with his friend Candlewick. All went well for 5 months. Then came a horrid surprise. What was the surprise? Well, when Pinocchio woke up one morning and started to scratch his head, he found, just guess what he found. Now, you knew that our Pinocchio had very tiny ears, so tiny you could hardly see them. So just imagine his shock when he touched his head and found that his ears had grown until they seemed a foot long. He rushed to find a mirror, but couldn't find one. So he poured some water into a wash bowl instead, and there in the water he saw the reflection. 2 long, magnificent donkey ears. Oh! How sorrowful and ashamed our poor Pinocchio felt. He sobbed in despair. He screamed. He knocked his head against the wall. But the harder he cried, the more his ears grew and grew and grew. Hair began sprouting on their tips. Ew. I think this is going to be a problem, you guys. So, hearing his heart-rending cries, a dormouse who lived on the first floor hurried into the room. Now, seeing the marionette in such a state, she asked anxiously, "What's the matter with you, my dear little fellow lodger?" "Oh, Mrs. Dormouse, I'm very sick and it frightens me. Do you know how to count a pulse?" "Perhaps." "Then see if I have a fever." The dormouse took Pinocchio's wrist and held it in her paw. In a few minutes, she said, "My little friend, I'm sorry, but I have some bad news for you." "What can it be?" cried Pinocchio. "You have a terrible fever," said the dormouse. "What kind of fever is it?" "The donkey fever." "I don't know what donkey fever is," said Pinocchio, who really did know all too well. "Then I'd better explain. In 2 or 3 hours, you will turn into a donkey, a real live donkey." "Oh, what shall I do? What shall I do?" cried Pinocchio, pulling wildly at his ears. "Dear boy," said the dormouse, "what can you do? Surely you know what the law says. Those boys who don't like to study, who hate school and spend all their time in play, always end at last by turning into little donkeys." "Do they really?" "Of course they do. And now crying won't do you a bit of good. You should have stopped and thought sooner." "Oh, but it wasn't my fault. Truly, it was all Candlewick's fault." "And who may Candlewick be?" "A boy I know. Oh, I wanted to go to school. I wanted to get my lessons and make the good fairy proud of me. But Candlewick told me, 'In the country of nothing but play, nobody studies. We can just play all day, from morning till night.'" "And why did you listen to a good-for-nothing scamp like that?" "Why? Oh, Mrs. Dormouse, because I'm a stupid, ungrateful marionette. If I weren't such a worthless creature, I never would have left my fairy, who did so much for me. And by this time, I would have turned into a real little boy, like lots of other marionettes." He started to go out the door, but remembered his donkey ears just in time. And being ashamed to have anyone see him, he made a cotton cap and put it on, pulling it way down over his ears. Then he set out to hunt for Candlewick. But Candlewick didn't seem to be around anywhere. Pinocchio went up and down each street and to all the theaters, everywhere. At last, he went to Candlewick's house and knocked. "Who's there?" called Candlewick from inside. "Pinocchio." "Well, wait a minute. I'll open the door." The next chapter companions in misery. Pinocchio waited and waited, and after a long time the door opened, and Pinocchio saw that his friend had a cap on too, pulled down over his ears. Pinocchio looked at that cap and felt a little better. Candlewick is in trouble too, he thought. I bet he has donkey fever just like me. But Pinocchio pretended not to notice anything. How are you today, Candlewick? He asked in the most cheerful tone in the world. As happy as a mouse and cheese. Cross your heart? Why should I tell a fib? Oh, maybe I shouldn't ask, but why are you wearing that cap? Oh, the doctor thought I'd better wear it. I hurt my knee. But Pinocchio, why are you wearing that great big cap? Well, the doctor told me to. I hurt my toe, you see. Oh, poor Pinocchio. Oh, poor Candlewick. Then for a long time, the boys didn't say anything at all. At last, Pinocchio sort of whispered, Pull up your cap just a little, won't ya? Nothing doing. Will you? Nothing doing. You see, well, one of my ears hurts pretty badly. One of mine does too. Oh, it does? Which one? Both. And you? Both. Have we got the same thing? I'm afraid so. Do something for me, Candlewick? Of course. Let me look at your ears. Well, all right. But let me see yours first. No, after you. Oh, all right then, said the marionette. Let's make a bargain. What bargain? Let's both take off our caps at the same time. All right, I'm willing. Ready then. And Pinocchio began to count. 1, 2, 3. At 3, both boys pulled off their caps and threw them up to the ceiling. And then, realizing that the same dreadful thing had happened to both of them, they burst into shouts of laughter. They laughed and laughed until they were weak. Suddenly, Candlewick stopped laughing and staggered. Turning white, he cried, Help me, Pinocchio! What's the matter? Oh dear, I can't stand up any longer. I can't either, cried Pinocchio. And at that very moment, they fell on hands and knees and began to run around the room on all fours. And as they were running, their arms turned into legs, and their faces grew long, and their bodies became all hairy. What used to be hands were now hoofs. But the very worst moment of all for those wretched boys was when each one felt a tail whisking behind him. Sad and ashamed, they tried to speak. Instead of sobs and cries, however, the only sound they could make was hee-haw, hee-haw. Now, if you're worried about Pinocchio, you will be happy to know that he finally learned his lesson. Yes, after many adventures and misadventures, he did get over his donkey fever, and he finally became, instead of a marionette, a real boy. The end. I hope you like your latest donkey fever story time story. Now remember, kid, I'm going to keep reading you stories, so subscribe, and that way you won't miss a single tale. And Donnie says, Hee-haw!